At Thursday's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, Senator Amy Klobuchar called for the passage of the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. The bill, which has bipartisan support, was held up at last week's Judiciary business hearing after a surprise amendment by Senator Ted Cruz, which was backed up by Senator John Kennedy. In today's hearing, Kennedy called for Cruz to explain a new amendment that they had worked on with Klobuchar. The new law is meant to help local newsrooms increase their revenue, which has been, in Cruz's words, trampled on by big tech.
Adopted.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I first just want to thank all the co-sponsors of the bill, Senator Feinstein. I want to thank you for your co-sponsorship of this bill and your strong remarks last 2 weeks ago. I want to thank you, Senator Durbin, for guiding us through, and Senator Graham, Senator Whitehouse, Blumenthal, Hirono, Booker, as well as several others, Senator Grassley, thank you, who have assisted with this bill. As I said before, we are at great risk of losing our news reporting because while U.S. newspapers' ad revenue plummeted $37 billion in 2008 to less than $9 billion in 2020, Google and Meta, also known as Facebook, became digital advertising titans, raking in billions in ad dollars while taking news content. So what we're doing here is really, really important, and I have so appreciated the last week. I have worked with Senator Kennedy, our lead Republican author, as well as Senator Cruz, to get at some of the concerns raised. And what's interesting about this, as this bill has been bipartisan from the beginning, Mr. Chair, we actually share the view that this is not about content, that this is simply about negotiating prices. And the platforms discussing and agreeing on issues. This was never the intent of the legislation to get at content. The goal of the bill is to allow local news organizations to get compensation when major titans, monopolies like Facebook and Google access their content. And it wasn't about facilitating negotiations about content. For reasons we discussed 2 weeks ago, I opposed Senator Cruz's initial amendment, and we held the bill over, as we should do, to allow the parties to negotiate. I also spoke with Senator Padilla about some of his concerns, and we included one of his amendments as well as several other changes that he had as we went into the negotiations. For the last 2 weeks, Senator Cruz, Kennedy, and I have been working on an amendment that would allow this bill to proceed. This amendment is the product of those negotiations, Amendment SIL 22B36. It replaces Senator Cruz's amendment with provisions that further clarify that the bill's focus is solely on compensation for news organizations when platforms access their content, and that discussions or agreements between news organizations and platforms on content are outside of the scope of the bill and outside of the scope of the narrow antitrust safe harbor under the bill. And the amendment accomplishes this goal without giving these tech companies a tool to avoid their obligations under the bill by disrupting their joint negotiations or arbitration that will get news organizations finally paid for their content. We agreed that this amendment addresses Senator Cruz's concerns in a content-neutral way in keeping with the original intent of the bill. Platforms like Facebook and Google are counting on Republicans and Democrats being unable to put aside their differences to agree on meaningful legislation in the tech center. This is our moment to prove them wrong. This amendment, the product of bipartisan negotiation, shows that we can work together to find common ground on these issues. I thank Senator Kennedy. I thank Senator Cruz for working with me in good faith to craft this amendment. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the amendment.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Let me now recognize the Republican co-sponsor, Senator Kennedy, if he'd like to make remarks relating to this amendment.
I don't have any remarks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear Senator Cruz's amendment.
I believe that Senator Klobuchar has offered the amendment. Am I correct, Senator?
Yes, I have.
Well, then I'd like to hear Senator Cruz explain it.
And Mr. Chairman,
Senator Cruz, Senator Padilla.
after Senator Cruz.
Senator Cruz, do you seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kennedy, let me commend the authors of this bill for the hard work they put in on an important issue. I agree that big tech exercises a concentration of power that I think is unknown in the history of mankind. And that concentration of power is regularly used to trample on the little guy, to trample on companies they do business with, and in this instance, to trample on local media organizations, whether you're talking about small-town newspapers, whether you're talking about local broadcasters, anyone in the journalism space that is producing content. Big tech routinely, daily, hourly, appropriates their content, rebroadcasts it, earns billions of dollars of revenue through advertisements in the process of broadcasting it, and gives not one penny of compensation for the creators of that content. I agree with Senator Klobuchar that that is an unfair system, and it is an abusive system. As I expressed at the initial markup we had on this bill, my principal concern is that big tech's abuse of power is not limited to the exercise of market power. They also abuse their power mightily in the public square. More and more, they are nakedly and brazenly engaging in censorship, silencing views they don't like. Right now, it so happens the views that they're silencing are right of center, but there's no guarantee that will continue. And indeed, for my Democratic colleagues, I would point out, whether you agree or disagree with the speech they're silencing, the idea that we would cede monopoly control of public discussion in America to 3 or 4 billionaires in Silicon Valley, modern-day American oligarchs, is profoundly dangerous. And you might agree with them today, but if they have the arbitrary power to decide tomorrow they disagree with you, and so your views, what you have to say, will be silenced, that is, I think, incredibly dangerous. My concern with this bill as initially drafted is the antitrust immunity directed at allowing smaller media outlets to negotiate reasonable compensation packages could be used as a shield to negotiate agreements to further censorship. I think that would be a terrible outcome, and as I said at the initial markup, if we were able to adopt my amendment to prevent censorship, to protect free speech, then I would support the bill. And if we could not adopt that amendment, then I would oppose the bill. Initially, as everyone here is aware, when we took up the amendment, a majority of this committee voted to adopt my amendment. At that point, the authors of the bill pulled down the bill from further consideration. In the 2 weeks that followed, I've had extensive conversations. I've had extensive conversations with Senator Kennedy, and I've had extensive conversations with Senator Klobuchar, and sat down and heard her concerns, and we worked together on this amendment. I think this is a good amendment. I think this is a significant amendment. I think this amendment protects against this antitrust liability being used as a shield for censorship. Big tech hates this bill. That, to me, is a strong positive for supporting it. Moreover, if this amendment is adopted, this will be the first meaningful consequence for and protection against censorship based on viewpoint and content in the big tech space. That's a big deal, and so I join Senator Klobuchar in urging support for this amendment.
At this point, 2 senators have sought recognition, Senator Padilla and then Senator Lee.